Yeah, and then I'll format it. Hi. Can't hear you yet. Now I can.
Hey.
There you go.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I had to bring in the 15-year-old engineer. Say hello.
Hello.
Those are the tech experts.
Without him, I'm lost. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm Barbara.
Hi, Barbara. Nice to meet you. I'm Liz.
And so where are you, Liz?
I'm in Jerusalem.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. See, it's dark outside.
Nighttime. Yes.
Yep.
Great.
And you're in Houston?
In Houston.
Yeah, I lived in Houston for many years before I made Aliyah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I went to the high school for the performing and visual arts.
Oh, wow. So did my daughter. Yeah.
Oh, what year was this? When did she go?
My daughter, let's see. Oh, she was born in 78. So she was there 12.
78. In the
90.
mid-80s?
Yeah. No.
78, 80. Yeah, right. 88, 90. Yeah, in the beginning of the 90s.
Early 90s. Yeah. She was in the dance program.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm ready to go. I have my PowerPoint.
Okay. And I've made you co-host so you can share.
Fabulous. So I always forget how to get the thing. I have to have the engineer. But from the Reich, from Germany, we see 56,000 Jews were sent. From the Protectorate, 69,703. In reality, almost every Jew from the Protectorate. Now, those of you who met family members who say, wait, we were from Czechoslovakia, but my family was only sent to Auschwitz in 1944, remember that those Jews at that point that had become part of Hungary. And this is Bohemia and Moravia, what is today is Bohemia. So these Jews are sent to Theresienstadt. Denmark, 464 Jews. That's going to be very important later on. Holland, about more than 2,000 Jews were sent in the end, excuse me, almost 4,000 Jews. And Ostmark is Austria. Now, the tent to this place, how do we have the artwork? How does this exist? And I'm going to show you the same artist whose artwork I showed you at the beginning. His name was Leo Haas. And the Nazis have all those brilliant people arriving in the ghetto. You have the Czech Jewry. Among them are some quite brilliant people. There's professors and artists and writers and musicians, opera singers, and then people who sell newspapers and people who, just live and work out daily lives in Prague. But you have this mix of these Czech Jewry and all of these very talented people. And the Nazis decided to take advantage of this talent. And they set up a art workshop. It was one of 2 or 3 that we know about. This was one that was set up by the Nazis to create graphics. And in German, it's called the Technische Abteilung. My German pronunciation is terrible. But you can see these artists working in these cramped conditions, creating artwork for the Nazis, a backpack, stuff like this kind of stuff, charts and pamphlets. In 1941, 1942, the commandant of the camp is trying to show the folks back in Berlin what an efficient place this is, how well run it is. So they want to have all these charts and pamphlets and stuff. Here they are creating that artwork. And among the artwork that's created, I'm going to show you a big contrast in a minute. One of my heroes was an artist called Bedřich Frita, who was murdered in 1944. He was from today's Czech Republic also. And when the Aufbaukommando arrives, they have to build barracks. They have to get the barracks ready for the masses of Czech Jews who are going to be forced into this camp. And he's among the Aufbaukommando. And the Nazis make him make this artwork showing, look how beautifully they're building these barracks for the Jews who are arriving. Look at the beautiful lumber and look at their clothing. They all have workmen's outfits on. They're well fed. Excuse me, they look like workmen who are taken care of, who have good working hours. But he doesn't want the world to think that's what it's really like. And this piece of artwork he creates in 1943. This is when more than 5,000 men were put in a barracks called the Sudeten Barracks. Were forced in 2 days, 5,000 men, to grab everything they owned, all the paltry possessions they were allowed to take with them into the camp, and move en masse to another barracks. Where and how they're going to find room, that's their problem. And if you look at the drawing in the front, look at the conditions in these barracks. Look how, instead of that beautiful lumber, this is what those people had to work with. They had old wood. The barracks were in abysmal conditions. The water wasn't running at the beginning. There's rats, there's fleas, it's cold, they can't heat the place. Electricity, when it does work, is not used at night. The conditions are appalling. We get a sense of that in the secret artwork that he creates for us. Not for the Nazis, for us, to bear witness. So through the eyes of these artists, we're going to see the stages of how people arrived in this camp and what their lives were like. So we're going back to Leo Haas, who's one of the few survivors of among these artists. And we'll talk about how he came to survive as we progress. But here we see the arrival of a transport. And it has a very curious name. Leo Haas, anyone who knows Czech Jews or Czech sense of humor, it's very biting, it's very sarcastic, it's very like, calls this piece of work Next to Last Station, Auschwitz. Well, it's not Auschwitz because the men here aren't wearing uniforms. You see the ones who are taking people off the trains in Auschwitz, I forgot what they call it in German, I'm having a memory lapse, are wearing their uniforms. The second to last station, Auschwitz, is Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt is a holding camp. It is a transit camp for people who are going to be sent to the east. Some people were only in Theresienstadt for 3 or 4 days. Some people were there for 3 years. Theresienstadt was not only a ghetto, it was also a concentration camp run by the SS, as you can see by this SS man standing here. And it was also a transit camp, has 3 functions. So here they are arriving. And what's so awful about this drawing, this ink drawing, is look at who they are. We see elderly people tumbling off this train. They can't even stand up. They're getting off in horrible weather. This man is like helping them get out. They're falling off the train. There's dead bodies lying among them. And look at the stance of this SS officer. He's just keeping himself dry. He's got his legs splayed in a position of power. He's got his cigar hanging out of his mouth. He's totally unmoved by what he's seeing here. This is the arrival. Now, for Jews who arrived to the ghetto in up until the summer of 1943, they don't actually arrive into Terezin. They arrive into a town that's about in miles, I guess a mile and a half, 2 miles. It's about 3.5 kilometers away from Terezin. It's called Bohusovice nad Oje, and in German it's called Bauschewitz. And they have to walk in terrible conditions from the train to the camp. And I know today there's a road that they've built from Terezin, which is still a little town and people still live there. It's kind of hard for us to understand that. I can't understand it, but people live there. It's their home. It has the aura of a ghost town, but there are still people who live there. And today there's a paved road that leads between these two little towns, between Bohusovice and Terezin, but in those days there wasn't. And these people have to walk along this kind of dirt track in the mud and in the rain and in the heat. And look who these people are. We have elderly people. Notice in the front, we have this little lady dragging her umbrella. We have a nurse. We have a family. The mother is heavily pregnant. The father is dragging the belongings on his back, not knowing that these things are simply going to be taken away from them once they arrive in the ghetto. And it has a very curious name. It's called SS Dog. I remember Leo Haas gives a little in his titles. And he actually makes this aquatint, which is a way of making a print, in the 1960s based on drawings that he had done in the ghetto, like one-on-one based on the drawings. So these are titles he gives in the 60s. And when you look at the dog, it's not, in my opinion, he's not the most threatening dog. He's not looking at the people. He's not snarling at them. He's kind of like, so it asks the question, who is the real animal here? Who is the real, bestial one here? And if you look behind this poor, sad, column of people walking, you'll see this dark figure. It almost looks like Darth Vader. And that's supposed to represent the SS, the guards. And the artist doesn't want your attention to be focused on him. The attention here is on the suffering of these people. And for those of you who are familiar with the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, the one that you see either at Yad Vashem or in front of today's Polin Museum in Warsaw, there's that big frieze of the uprising. And if you go to the back, there's this very sad kind of parade of people going to Treblinka. There, as in this drawing, there's only one person who looks at us. And if you look closely, you'll see there's a little boy in between the parents here. Everyone else is kind of in their own misery, not looking at us, but he looks right at us. And I always think, what is that kid saying to us? Why did you let this happen? How is this allowed to happen? I'm a child. Why is this happening to me? It's a very deliberate view. He's looking at us. No one else here is regarding us. So this is the SS dog. Look at this, another drawing he makes of that long walk from Bohusovice into the camp. But do you notice, I don't know if you can see my thing, what's on the guard tower here? Does everyone see the V? That's secret. Again, this is artwork that is going to, it's a secret. This is to show what's happening. You see that long, lonely, long freezing cold walk. And I go to Terezin quite often in the winter and it is cold. And these trees that are very pretty in the summer look like skeletal hands reaching up. And he really kind of captures that entry into the camp. And here they are entering this old garrison town. And you can see the titles, a new transport has arrived, and look at the guard again. Leo Haas always draws the guards with their legs splayed. I think psychologists will tell you, that stance with the legs splayed is a stance of power. The flag almost has a presence looking at them. And there they are entering this terrible place that's to be their new home. Well, in 1943, only in the summer of 43, the Nazis actually extend the railway line into Terezin. And you can see who the workmen are who have to do the work. Look at the workers doing this hard physical labor. Notice all the elderly people, these half-starved people, these broken people who are having to do the labor, extending the railway line into the camp itself. And notice on the brick here again, that V. I'm so I admire so much the kids who were in this camp, because here we are, we're kvetching a little bit. We have a pandemic. Well, you have to wear a mask when I go into the supermarket. People, kvetch. These kids are living without their parents. They're living in terrible conditions. They can't go to school. They're being secretly educated. And they still try and meet this challenge through poetry and through art and through comradeship and through trying to boost each other up and secret education. It leaves me again and again and again just marveling at their resilience and how brilliant they were. And one of them is a little boy, and it's weird to be a 57-year-old woman who has a 13-year-old hero, but one of them is my hero. His name was Hanus Hachenberg. He was murdered in Auschwitz at the age of 14. This kid would have been a brilliant poet, playwright, we'll never know. But he writes this poem about that first train that comes into the ghetto. It says it stopped at the wooden barrier, whistling woefully. It can't have wanted to go on to a place beyond the grave and destroy the colors painted on its body. Step by step, it covered the new track. 3 children with large wandering eyes watched as the wheels turned and the train drove down the street. I closed my eyes. So this is what an unbeating heart of steel driven by steam looks like. It gives the world no choice at all. Under your wheels, my dear, I go a little further. The worms turn green on the iron tracks. They groan because they're made of muscle and whisper aloud their song of love. You monster, I'm alive. I too am alive. Very sadly, one of these trains would carry Hannes Hachenberg to Auschwitz, where he eventually was gassed. Now, a common misconception about Theresienstadt, another misconception, is that everyone here was sent to Auschwitz. And I want to burst that bubble because I think it's very, very important that we know if 88,000 people, and by the way, let me just give you a few statistics. In 1942, the worst year of the camp, and the fall of 1942 was the absolute worst. In 1942, there was about 160,000 people forced into this terrible place. 88,000 of them were sent to the east. About 3,000 of those sent to the east survived. Of the more than 9,000 children who were sent to this camp, only about 932 survived deportation to the east. And more than 34,000 died in the camp itself. Statistically, it's almost as much as Warsaw Ghetto. But about 42,000 of those people never went to Auschwitz because beginning January 9th, 1942, trains begin to deport people to places in the east. Now, Auschwitz wasn't yet a functioning camp when many of these trains take off. Auschwitz, Auschwitz is created in 1940 as a camp for Polish prisoners. The first Jews arrived there in March 42, but the extermination for Jews really kind of kicks off in the spring of 1942, really starts to pick up around then, summer of 42. But before that, in January 42, they're sending trains to Riga, they're sending trains to Lublin, to Warsaw, to Izbica, and Mali Trosten. It's a terrible camp near Minsk that most of you have never heard of, and about 60,000 Jews were murdered in Mali Trosten. About the same amount of Jews who were murdered in Majdanek were murdered in that camp. And as you see, in the September and October of 1942, about 10 transports to the terrible death camp of Treblinka. Of those 10 transports that were sent with about 10,000 Jewish people, mainly elderly people, I think three of them survived. One of them was Richard Glazer, who takes part in the uprising in Treblinka. Almost all of them were murdered upon arrival. And this very sad statistic of the 42,005 people sent to the east up until October 1942, 224 are known to have survived out of 42,000. And they're mainly people who were sent to Riga at the beginning because there was a selection in Riga and men were selected to work. And then from, you could see in 1943, 1942, under 42, 43, all the transports, with a few exceptions, went to Auschwitz. Okay, now we're going to get into life. Once those people arrive in the ghetto and are simply everything they have is stolen from them upon arrival, I'm going to show you again two contrasting pieces of artwork by an artist called Joe Spear, who was an artist from Holland, a very well-known artist. He was worked a lot in newspapers, wonderful artist. And the Nazis used his artwork to show how nice the ghetto was. When they have the visitation of the Red Cross in 1944, they're given this booklet, and you can see a like postcard set, and you can see an example that Joe Spear is forced to create of a courtyard in Tel Aviv, and look how nice it is. The trees are flowering, and everyone was so idyllic, and war-torn Europe, and yet look how nice the Jews are living in Tel Aviv. But he makes this drawing in 1943 showing the real conditions. And the Jews are living in this camp in overcrowded barracks, one bunk bed above the other, absolutely no privacy. Survivors talk about, fleas and dirt, and running water is not plentiful, and you have to wait in line for everything. You have to wait in line to eat. You have to wait in line to go to the bathrooms. They turn off the lights at night, the electricity at night. There's no heating. There's no privacy. People are coming and going all the time, being transported and being all of these terrible things. And he shows this room with all these things hanging here and suitcases everywhere, and out the window, again, that SS flag, like we saw with Leo Haas, almost this presence. It's like it's peeking in the window. It's standing there right in the middle of the artwork. Notice how the artist put it almost in the exact middle. It's got a presence. It's right there. That's your reality. Everything you do, your whole life, the SS is there. And that's why Theresienstadt is actually also a concentration camp, because it was run by the SS. Another artist, Maurice Nagel, who was actually arrested painting. He was a plein air painter. He used to like going out and painting in nature and farms. And he's actually arrested while he's painting, and he's sent to Terezin with his whole family. He has this weird, kind of beautiful obsession with painting the barracks, but painting the barracks in such a way that he tries to instill some sense of order and decency in the overcrowded places. He doesn't put people in there. And you can see how crowded it is. I mean, these are people who had homes like you and I. These are people who had, personal possessions, who had kitchens, who had private bathrooms, who had everything that most people have. And now they've been reduced to this for the sole reason because they are Jewish. And he wants to show what the conditions are like. But there's still a sense of cleanliness here. There's still a sense of order. And he goes so far to show on the suitcases. And by the way, most of us don't have suitcases sitting in our living room. Suitcases are away. So when we travel, we take them out. But the presence of suitcases gives this feeling of impermanence. We don't know when you're going to be called for a transport. You don't know when you're going to move. You don't know when something is going to happen, like in the Sudeten barracks, where 5,000 men have to just move in 2 days. And so we have this feeling of something not permanent. And yet he also puts the names on the suitcases. And if any of you have ever visited Auschwitz-Birkenau and have been to Auschwitz I, the museum, you'll see a display of suitcases. Many of those suitcases were actually brought by the Czech Jews who arrived in some of the last transports in October 1944, before the gas chambers ceased to work. So it's some of the same, well, the Nazis stopped the gas chambers from working as the Soviet army is approaching, and they don't want to be caught, like the hand, if you will. Also, there's something that looks like a talit hanging there. Does everyone see it? Something very touching about that. That, it will be easy to abandon faith, to abandon God, to abandon everything that got you into this mess in the first place, being a Jew. And the opposite happens here also, because many Czech Jews are very assimilated. They're very different than Polish Jews. They didn't speak Yiddish, they spoke Czech or German. There was a movement in Czechoslovakia called the Czech nationalist movement in the 1860s. Many Jews identified as Czechs, or many Jews were Zionists and wanted to speak Hebrew. And many of them come back to Judaism in Theresienstadt. They kind of refine themselves as Jews in Theresienstadt, which is something very beautiful about that also, that you would kind of, sad and beautiful, that would be the thing that would bring you back to your Judaism. Another amazing artist who I admire so much, Dr. Karl Fleischmann, who was also murdered in 1944. He was among these artists, 4 of them. It's called the artists, I forget what to say in English, but they were caught by the Nazis for making horror propaganda. Friends, I want you to understand, this stuff I'm showing you is dangerous. If you're caught making this artwork, you're murdered. And 4 of these artists are caught, and they're sent to the little fortress, which is a concentration camp, the prison outside of Terezin. Terezin is the ghetto, and then there's a prison concentration camp outside that was only for Czech non-Jew prisoners. There was the Artists' Affair, it's called. It was in 1944. And the 4 artists were sent to Auschwitz. Only one of them survived, that was Leo Haas. And poor Karl Fleischmann, Dr. Karl Fleischmann did not survive. And he also had his hands crushed, so he would not be able to create artwork ever again. But he still tried to draw in the camps to bear witness with his crushed hands. And we see this kind of frenzied view of the barracks. I mean, look at the line, how frenzied it is. It's just, you know, this isn't a place of how Nagel sees of order and he's trying to find order in the chaos. Here we see the bunk beds and people going up and down the ladders and all their things all over, and there's no room to breathe, and it's very claustrophobic, and there's no privacy. You really feel this in this drawing. And Bredrik Frita, again, the one whose artwork I showed you at the beginning, who shows us the Sudeten barracks moving, makes this drawing of the conditions in the barracks. You know, all these people squished in together. We see elderly people, we see a child, we see a man who looks like he's starving. Again, this presence of suitcases, the presence of, you know, this impermanence. There's no electricity, so we have this candlelight here. People are reading by candlelight. This is the conditions in the barracks. And Pavel Fanto, another brilliant artist, and another doctor who was actually a doctor, a Jewish doctor in the Czech army, who was forced to resign his position because he's a Jew. Fabulous sense of humor, very sarcastic. Was murdered, I think, on Death March in 1945. Shows us Christmas in Terezin. Now, first of all, there were about 10% of the prisoners in this camp were Jews who were not Jews anymore, Jews who had converted to Christianity. And according to the Nuremberg laws, they're still considered Jews because they still had Jewish blood. But in many places in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, I don't know if anyone here is of Russian heritage. Soviet, you know, came from Soviet Union after it collapsed in 1989, after it, 1991. Many Russian Jews celebrate with a Christmas tree. It's kind of like a New Year tree. It doesn't have religious significance. It's something that you see with Jews from Eastern Europe, and never called Czech Republic Eastern Europe, you'll insult them, and Central Europe. So here we have Christmas in from the Aufbau Commando, the ones who arrive in November 1941. And you can see the year 1941. Notice that's not a 7 because it doesn't have the little line through it. In Europe and in Israel, 7 has a line. So 1941, he's still looking pretty healthy. He's kind of got red cheeks. See the Christmas tree, little lights on. He has a big pack filled with stuff. He's got beds with pillowcases and sheets. And as we go through these 4 stages, 1942, he's already got patches on his clothes. There's now only 2 candles. His little peculot there on the walls are already less filled. The bedding is no longer, the sheets are no longer on the bed. And by 1944, it says, God help us. You can see he's been reduced to a skeleton and there's almost nothing left. And the name of this drawing is Metamorphosis. But again, a little hope. And, Hanukkah is upon us soon. And Alec Liebau-Letsky, who was a Jew from Czech Republic, again, one of those amazing Czech senses of humor. They're like, Yiddish sense of humor, Polish, it's all this kind of sense of humor from Jews from this part of the world. It makes these very kind of cynical and funny and drawings. But like many Czech Jews there, he was also an ardent Zionist. And his wife, who couldn't live with him, they were separated, men and women were separated, was living in what's called Bet Halutzot, Chalutz being a pioneer. And these were women who wanted to come and build Eretz Yisrael. And thank God he did survive, and so did his wife. But here you can see Hanukkah in this terrible, crowded room. And you see there's the Chanukiah on the table. They painted on the wall, women, toiling the soil of Eretz Yisrael. There's Shabbat candles there. They had an oneg every Friday. They and an oneg on Shabbat. They had the oneg. There's this attempt to keep up the spirit. There's an attempt to try and find something beyond the terrible conditions they were living in. And as horrible as these conditions were, and as horrible as the fact that most of these people did not survive, the survivors we have are a rarity. Most people can't tell us their story, can't tell us what happened. They were murdered. All traces of them disappeared. Something very, I think, very beautiful and uplifting, that we should never take for granted that even though it's not such a great year, and even though we may have a Hanukkah without our families this year, that we can be free people who have Hanukkah, and that we can celebrate it the way we choose. Because even in a terrible place like Terezin, they still did it. And for me, that's very, very inspiring. Here's some other deceptions the Nazis use in the camp. And one of the strangest ones, which they do in Terezin Ghetto and also in Lodz Ghetto, is they create fake money. And they go so far with this fakery in Terezin that in 1943, they actually set up a Jewish self-administration bank, which had about 40 tellers working in the bank. People had bank books and they got fake money. And the only thing you could buy with this money is perhaps pay a library fine, because they had quite a large library from books that had been confiscated from people as they come into the ghetto. And I think you could buy like mustard or something with it. It's like, you can't buy anything else. So here we have a brilliant artist called Peter Keen, brilliant, brilliant man, another one of my heroes, murdered at the age of 25 in Auschwitz. This is the official pamphlet he has to make for the Nazis. And Joe Speer, the Dutch artist who I just told you about, who created this packet for the Red Cross, this is how he portrays the bank. And it looks like a real bank, right? Here's the money. And the money has a very interesting story. The artist was Peter Keen, the 25-year-old kid I just told you about. And it's called Moses Conan because it has Moses on it. And the absurd idea that the only figure that Jews can relate to would be Moses. That's the only Jewish figure throughout history they can relate to. But you have to have an artist to create the Moses. So among this art pool of these very smart, very talented artists, Peter Keen was chosen to create the Moses. Now, before it gets engraved, and what you see here is an engraved bill, the artist creates the artwork, paints it, inks it, and then it's sent to an engraver. In this case, the engraver was in Prague. And he creates a Moses who looks kind of like the guy on the left, this dignified patriarch, handsome, white bearded, very handsome Jewish man. And apparently one of the high up SS officials, some people say it might've been Reinhard Heydrich, who was the dictator, if you will, of Bohemian Moravia, sees this and says, no good. This Moses looks too Jewish, doesn't look Jewish enough. Moses was ugly. Moses was a Jew. Moses had a big nose. Moses had black curly hair. You have to redo the Moses. And I can tell you as a graphic designer, when you have a client who just kind of gets you angry, you just like do it dafka, you do it on purpose, that's what they want, I'm gonna give it to them. You can see the Moses on the right is kind of the the Nazis' vision of what Moses would look like. You know, he's got a hooked nose, all these stereotypical, you know, what non-Jewish people say Jews have. So that was the official Moses. If you see here, that's the Moses that was used on the Moses Conan. Another thing you've heard about, and you know, it's kind of entered the mythology of the ghetto, is the cafe. And yes, there was a cafe in ghetto Tevozin that was established in 40. The Nazis let the Jews perform music as long as it wasn't something that would interfere with, you know, something subversive, something that would you know, didn't have some kind of subversive message against the Nazis. They actually went to performances and enjoyed them. Didn't stop them from sending Jews off to be murdered who were taking part in the performances, but they were allowed. And in the ghetto, there was also a cafe. Now, most people never got a chance to see these performances. The myth that everyone spent, you know, went shuttling back and forth between opera and all, it didn't happen. If you were lucky, maybe you got to see a performance twice a year. There was a ghetto jazz quartet or whatever, jazz group. But most people didn't get a chance to see that. And Leo Haas wants you to make sure that you knew that. So this is called the Ghetto Cafe. And look at who's in the cafe. Every once in a while, they'll let some of these poor elderly people out of their attic and come into the cafe for half an hour to have some ersatz coffee, if you were lucky, but usually that's a glass of water. And look at these poor people kind of shoved one on top of the other. In Europe at the time, the symbol of someone who was blind was that white patch with the 3 dots on it. Many elderly people were forced to live with people who had disabilities and people who had mental illness. There was really not a lot of people to take care of them. And you can see this is the cafe. This is the condition of the people in the cafe. And there's some poor old guy, you know, playing a cello there. But in the front, there's this one little lady and her hands are clasped together and she's looking at the music. And I always think this is a woman who 10 years before had gone every day to, you know, to as many performances as she could of the Vienna symphony, you know, symphony, and had seen operas and had been active in the cultural life of Vienna or Berlin or Prague. And now here she is, you know, this one little moment of light in the cafe. But there's a very sinister figure here also. I don't know if everyone noticed here in the window on the left, you'll notice an SS man kind of peeking in. And right next door to this cafe was the SS Kommandantur, where the SS had offices. And in the basement of the joint basement in between the cafe and the SS Kommandantur was a torture room. And one of the wags of the ghetto wrote a poem. In the cafe, you can get coffee and whipped cream or chocolate and whipped cream, and next door you can just get whipped. And Adolf Ossenberg, another brilliant artist, also murdered in 1945, shows us the cafe. And you'll notice again, the elderly people sitting there, not really listening to the music. It's just kind of a respite of being stuck up in attics. And now we're going to talk about those elderly people because they're really an overlooked aspect of Theresienstadt. And it can't be that these people were just like swept away into history and nobody remembers them. And I've seen quite a few inquiries that people have sent to Theresienstadt. I'm looking after a woman who was my mother's sister, and she must have been in her 70s when she arrived. And the answer is always, we have less information on elderly people. It just doesn't exist. And we're going to talk about those people now. And here we have Peter Keen again, this commission pamphlet commissioned by the Nazis. And this is the state of affairs in Theresienstadt in October 1942. And it says the age differences or ages in German. And you can see 0 to 15-year-old kids, there's 2,761 kids of that age. 16 to 55-year-old people, there's 17,715 people of that age. But here on the left, it says over the age of 66, there are more than 32,788 people. Many of these elderly people were Jews who came from Germany and Austria. They were alone. Most of them did not come with their families, and the majority of them were women. And why? Why did so many German elderly Jewish people come? The Nazis were kind of aware of what world opinion might be, could be, what the opinion of people in Germany could be. And indeed, there were a handful of people who asked, what's happening to our friends and neighbors? And the answer they usually got was, oh, we're sending them off to work in the East. We've built towns for them. They're going to be working. They're going to be having new lives in the East. And some of the braver ones among these people said, oh, really? You're sending the upstairs neighbor away to the East? The upstairs neighbor is 91 years old. She's blind and sits in a wheelchair. What kind of work is this woman going to do in the East? Or, oh, you're sending the neighbor away from downstairs to the East? He's a World War I veteran. He lost his legs fighting for Germany in World War I. What kind of work is he going to do in the East? And the Nazis come up with this plan at the Wannsee Conference to kind of cover their tracks, to cover their intentions. And it would be to offer the Jews the elderly Jews of Germany and Austria, they would be forced to sell their homes. And this is called a house purchasing contract. And they were offered a house in the spa town of Theresienstadt, where in exchange for the home that they're selling, they would be given adequate living facilities. They'd be given an apartment. The contract says they'll be given laundry. They'll have meals, hot meals provided. There'll be medical care. It's not exactly what they were expecting. They can't guarantee that they'll get that. So they kind of, in legalese, they kind of, got out of guaranteeing what they were offering here. And then these poor people had to sign this. And once they sign away everything they own, they were taken from their homes. And if anyone's ever visited Berlin, a neighborhood called Mitte, which was a Jewish neighborhood, it's where the new synagogue is, that beautiful synagogue that still stands. They were taken to a Jewish functional building on Gross Hamburgerstrasse. They were stuck in a room with no, an area with no food and no bed. Some of them were there for an entire week. And when they had enough of these elderly people gathered together, they marched them about 8 kilometers through the city of Berlin. Now, can you imagine, people are going about their daily lives, and there's these bedraggled groups of these elderly people holding their little bundles, walking through the city, limping through the city. They go to 3 different train stations and they're sent off to the East. Not the East, it's not that East. They're sent off to Theresienstadt. And I just want to show you, if you do get a chance to go to Berlin, one of the stations that we're sent from is a platform called Platform 17. It's in the Grunewald station. And they have every single transport that left Germany. Most of them went to Theresienstadt. And it wasn't enough for me. I take students there. It's not enough for me just for the students just to see the names of the camps. I want them to see the people who were on these transports. And I usually give the students this little piece of paper and let them try and find the transport. And then they put the paper down with a rock, kind of a symbolic, what you do in a cemetery. Look at the ages here. Joanna Gumpel was 95 years old. She was born in 1847 when she was sent to Theresienstadt. She survived there for maybe 4 or 5 months, and then she died in Theresienstadt. She died from the terrible conditions. By the way, of the 35,000 people who died in the camp, 90% of them, according to historian Anna Hayakova, were elderly people, 90%. Hermann Goldstein was 89 when he was sent and murdered in Theresienstadt. And one of them, this beautiful artist called Julie Wolthorn, look at that gorgeous drawing on the right there, was an artist from Berlin. She was already in her late 70s when she was sent to the camp, and she even makes artwork in the camp, but she dies in Theresienstadt. She was born in 1864, and it says she died in Theresienstadt. Now, one of the artists, Norbert Toller, who does survive, shows us the living conditions of these elderly people. And in the camps, they're put into attics. So you have these great big buildings from the 1780s. In those days, there were massive ceilings. These are military buildings, so they're very, very big. And, going up to the attic is quite a schlep. And here he shows us this little elderly lady having to climb up these steps. And they had to do this every day to get up into the attic. And he writes years later, in this drawing that he makes in 1943, he writes, 42 steps in one flight, and 2 of these flights, and the old people live in the hot attic and die there. An artist called Moritz Müller, who was well known in the art world of Prague. He had I think it was a gallery. It's really, amongst the arty set. Had people come to the gallery and they've had readings and art. Anyway, when he arrives in Terezin, he volunteers to work in the hospital for people who have urinary issues, kidney issues. And, if you have a urinary tract infection in Terezin, it's a death sentence. There's no antibiotics. There's not really a good hospital. And he volunteers to give these people a little comfort in their last, their days in this hospital with some very dedicated and wonderful nurses. And he does something else. He says, look at these people. These are people who had lives before. They were people of substance. They had respect. They had lived their lives. And now in their last days, here they are in this strange place, dying in these hospital wards that stink of urine. Their dignity is trying to be taken away from them by the Nazis. And he makes more than 400 drawings of these people. It's incredible. 400 drawings, very sensitive, very beautiful drawings showing their faces. And he also writes down their names sometimes. He would sit and talk with them and interview them and, tell them stories or listen to their stories. And he makes 400 of these drawings. So here we have an elderly patient, 1944. Hans Krauter from Vienna. I've looked up this man. I tried to find out who he was. I haven't found out anything about him. But Moritz Müller captures him for us to see in 1943. Poor Moritz Müller himself was also deported to Auschwitz and murdered in 1944. Bedřich Frita shows us those elderly people living in storefronts and all the shops that existed in the ghetto. This overcrowding is so outrageous that people are living in shops, terrible conditions, and here they are. And does everyone see the V? There's the V again. And Leo Haas shows again, what's fascinating, I'm going to show you soon, is how different artists are capturing the same scenes. The historians, when people give the same testimony of an event, it really, enforces how the veracity of that event. So here we see again, these elderly people living in the shop. This one by the brilliant artist Charlotte Borisova. Mr. Schauer visits his wife in the barracks. Poor couple. Notice there's no privacy here. Notice the suitcases here, suitcases all over. And when you actually see this at Yad Vashem, their name is on the suitcase. And we know that this couple were sent to Mali Trotzedents and murdered when they were in their 70s. And Dr. Karl Fleischmann, again, I love this portrait. There's something so touching and beautiful about this. You know that as he sat in front of this woman, the way he shows her eyes looking into you, and that she's such a compassionate, sweet woman who's so, you just want to reach out and hug her. And he captures this anonymous woman in 1943, as does Bedřich Frita. This drawing is very powerful. And they often show it to teachers to use in their classrooms. It's before the transport. And here we have a woman again, and again, that these people are reduced to nothing, everything that they had before, everything they had created in their lives, all of their identity, none of that exists anymore. And notice that the shadow is over her face. And the one thing we do see is that Jewish star. That's what the light is on. That's where the emphasis is on. To the Nazis, this isn't a viable human being. It's just a star, a person to be deported and murdered. Oh, okay, we're getting a little, I can go on for hours, but I think we'll talk about 15 minutes more because I don't want to tire you out. Another one, Ado Unger. I'm actually writing a paper now about the depiction of elderly people in Terezin because it's such an unknown, thing, and people just don't know about it, and we have to make sure they're not forgotten. Okay. Just to give you a quick statistic, this is transport BP from Theresienstadt to Treblinka. I just want you to see the age on here, this pie chart. There were 8 men who were above the age of 86. There were 10 women, 86 years old. There were 589 men from 61 to 85 years old on this transport. 1,343 women, age group 61 to 85, and 37 women, 46 to 60. One of them was Czech, 977 were German citizens, 101 Jews of Austrian citizenship, no survivors. None. As you know, in Treblinka, maybe some of you know, Treblinka was probably statistically worse than Auschwitz. Of the almost 1 million Jews who were sent there, only about 70 survived, if that much, because there was an uprising there. But it was a complete and utter and total death camp. And 10 transports go from Terezin to Treblinka in the terrible fall of 1942. All right, I'm going to show you this real quick. Ways artists bear witness to the same events. And one of the most bizarre events that happens is in 1943, right after the uprising in Bialystok ghetto. You know, anyone who says the Jews didn't try and fight back, well, almost 100 ghettos have uprisings. Almost 100. We all know about Warsaw Ghetto uprising, but almost 100. The Jews tried to fight back against impossible odds. And there's a large uprising in Bialystok. When the uprising is quelled, the survivors, before they're sent and murdered, are offered this weird deal to take about 1,003, I forgot the exact number, a little bit more than 1,000 children, who the Nazis are going to take away, kind of remove from the ghetto. And we think the reason was that they were going to be used as exchanges for German soldiers, and that they would eventually be sent here to what was then Palestine, today Israel. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem put the knockers on that one. He didn't want it to happen. So the Nazis didn't know what to do with these kids. In the meantime, when they thought the deal might be on, they send the kids to Terezin. They're there for about 2 months. When the deal falls through, the children were sent on Yom Kippur, right around Yom Kippur, October 5th, 1943, are sent to Auschwitz. About 53 of the nurses and doctors who had been assigned to look after them in Terezin were sent with them. And when they were sent into the camp, no one was allowed to look at these kids. No one was allowed to interact with these kids. The kids were bedraggled. They were, you know, in rags. They spoke Yiddish, they spoke Polish. Remember, most Czech Jews did not speak Yiddish. There was no way to communicate with them, and they're put into separate little enclosure that no one could get into. And these 53 nurses and doctors and educators who are put in there with the children meet their fate, their same fate as the children. They're sent away and murdered in Auschwitz with them. And we have at least 6 artists who draw that. So Leo Haas says, children marching in the ghetto. Here they are entering the ghetto. Look at these poor little creatures coming in under the heavy SS guard. The people who come in with them wearing like these suits, almost like those suits we have in hospitals today. I don't know if it's to keep them anonymous or to keep them away from disease, whatever it is. They have these suits on. You'll see it depicted in a few of the drawings. Another artist, Ernst Morgenstern, who survives, moves to Australia after the war, never draws again. He was a lawyer. He only drew when he was in the ghetto, secretly by himself. Nobody knew he was creating artwork. Creates this drawing of the children arriving. Pavel Fanto, who's I've introduced you to before, also shows us the Polish children. Otto Unger, the one who made that beautiful portrait of the elderly woman, shows us the children arriving, again with the guards. And Helga Vaisova, who I can do a whole talk about also, was only 13, and under the instructions of her father to draw what she sees, draws these children coming into the ghetto. And here's the actual list of those children who were sent. And of all those kids, 1,196 is the exact number. We only know what one of them looked like. Only one. And her name was Devorah Kay, and she was a daughter of Nahum and Masha. Somehow a picture was found of her. For almost all of those other kids who arrived from Bialystok, they were murdered. Their parents were murdered in Bialystok. Nahum and Masha survived. That's one artistic depiction. Other one I'll leave for next time, if we have a next time. I'm just going to talk about kids real quick. one of them, again, it's weird when you're got to be 57 and you have an idol who is 16. And one of them is a little boy called Peter Gins. And this kid is a wunderkind. He's a little Prague kid, brilliant, brilliant kid. He's an artist and a writer and a little scientist. This is wunderkind. And when he arrives in Terezin, he's stuck into this home for boys. And instead of like rocking back and forth in the corner and feeling sorry for themselves, these boys, as my British husband says, just kind of get on with it. They have secret education, they help each other, they make what's called the Republic of Shkid, which means they're all going to be there helping each other. And they even set up their communal living room to look like Wenceslas Square, for those of you who have been to Prague, because they miss their home so much. They miss Prague, they miss their families, they missed all these normal things that have been taken away from them. And Peter makes this beautiful poem besides his artwork, and I'll just read you the last stanza because he's wondering, well, he misses Prague so much, it's a beautiful city, but he's sure Prague doesn't miss him like he misses Prague. And he says, for a year I've been stuck in an ugly hole. Instead of your beauties, I've a few streets alone. Like a wild animal trapped in a cage, I remember you, my Prague, a fairy tale of stone. And he does this drawing from memory, remembering his city, remembering his house, remembering the city he had been so much part of. And I actually went to his home you can't go in, it's a private house today, this is his apartment. Look how accurate that is from his memory, that he draws from his memories of Prague. And if you go to it, there's the house he lived in, and there's his Stolpersteiner, Peter Gins, murdered at the age of 16 in Auschwitz. Helga Weissova, whose artwork I just showed you. And one last thing I'll talk about before we have to stop. It's perhaps one of the craziest things of all that happens. And there's that V. Does everyone see the V again? And it all has to do with the Danish Jews. Remember I said I would come back to the Danish Jews. Well, most of the Jews of Denmark, some of you may be aware, were saved. They were kind of spirited to safety in about a month in a secret effort by the Danish underground. But about 390 could not be warned in time. 390. And they were sent to Terezin. And the Danish monarch was one of the only leaders in the world who actually cared enough about his own people to demand a Red Cross visit. And he's told, all right, you want to come visit? We need a little time to get ready. And that time to get ready, about 11,000 Jews from the ghetto were sent in different naglot, in Hebrew, different transports to what we call the Czech family camp, right at the beginning of Birkenau, the death camp of Auschwitz. If the Red Cross would want to visit Auschwitz, want to visit them in Auschwitz, that would be right there where you can access them and see them. They're given slightly better conditions. And the ghetto goes through this what could only be described as a Potemkin village. All of the route of the Red Cross is kind of mapped out, and upon the route everything is painted and flowers are planted, and a handful of people are forced to become like actors, if you will. So when the Red Cross goes from one point to the other, they'll see these beautiful scenes. And Frederick Friedrich said, "Don't be fooled." And look how he draws. Look at the little person in the window here, this elderly person, and these skeletal figures kind of kissing each other here, and the bodies and the trash lying behind. But in the front, and you can see them propped up, that's the facade that the Red Cross is going to be seeing. And by the way, we see a few coffins that have kind of fallen off the hearse that's used to transport things around. Here's Joe Spear, makes his drawing for that visit to show the Red Cross. By the way, there were only 3 Red Cross representatives. One of them is a real piece of who we'll talk about in a minute, but a real piece of work, if you will. We'll talk about him in a minute. Look how beautiful, and here these beautifully dressed people are in the middle of the ghetto, listening to music. And Nazis actually took the center part of the ghetto, and this is Joe Spear's drawing of this middle park, which was non-accessible. In the middle, they had made this big like circus tent, and it was used as a mini concentration camp, and Jews were forced to make big boxes and other things in this little mini labor camp, if you will. All of that comes out. Here's Leo Haas doing it. I love the title here, Make Way for the Superman Commander. All that comes down. And this beautiful park emerges, and we could see people beautifully dressed. It's all a sham. It's all a hoax. And the terrible person, Maurice Russell, who's this 25-year-old kid. He was with the, I think it's the Swiss Red Cross. This is a nice, comfy job for him. He gets to go and inspect places. And he is fooled hook, line, and sinker by this facade. He takes about 25 pictures of people who will be shortly murdered after. He doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't ask why the head of the Jewish Council, Epstein, who had a black eye, he doesn't say, why does he have a black eye? What's happened to him? He doesn't ask to talk to any people. He said, what are the Jews complaining about? This is a beautiful place. It's obviously an Endlager. Endlager means that it's not a, it's like final camp. They won't be sent anywhere else. What are they fetching about? Years later, he was asked by Claude Lanzmann, those of you who are familiar with Shoah, he's asked, he interviews him and says, why didn't you talk to any of these people? Why don't you go up to any of these Jewish people and say, hey, what is this really like? What are conditions like here? And he says, it's not my fault, it's the Jews' fault. They should have come up to me. They should have told me what was really going on here. It's not my fault. Well, because of this report, and this is the most terrible thing of all, Eichmann had granted the Red Cross permission to visit 2 camps. One of them was Terezin, and the second one was Birkenau. And they had actually visited Auschwitz. He had visited Auschwitz and didn't report anything really bad there. And when the Birkenau, which is up and running as a terrible death camp at this point, when the Red Cross says, hey, what are the Jews complaining about with Terezin, this nice place, the Red Cross cancels the visit to Birkenau. Doesn't come to Birkenau. All the Jews who were in the Czech family camp are murdered. If you recall in history, the great deportation and mass murder of the Jews of Hungary is waiting in the wings. That happens in the summer of 1944. The Red Cross doesn't come and visit. And we have this Maurice Russell character is one of the reasons. So I could go on and talk about so many aspects of Terezin for hours and hours and hours. I'm gonna stop here. I'm just gonna read this one last little thing. I can't see all of it because there's people's faces over it. But Ruth Bondi, who is a very dear person and he becomes a famous Israeli journalist and is really one of the great voices of Terezin. She gathers all this material and she writes all these essays. And she says that is the importance of transmitting the material on Ghetto Terezin for future generations. Not only the testimony of an era, but the testimony for the readiness of individuals to accept responsibility for the community, not to give up, testimony for the ability of man to learn, to create, to laugh, to love life, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And I think there's a little message in that for all of us in this very trying year and this very scary time for us. That we can gain strength from their resilience in face of such horrible, adversity. And most people who did not have a future and didn't make it. So by learning their stories and by seeing their artwork and remembering them, we give them a little bit of history. Okay, well, that's it, folks. I can't hear anybody, so. Barbara, if you're talking to me, I can't hear you. Barbara Goldstein, you may be talking, but you're muted.
Thank you. So could you please tell a little bit about the retreat of the Germans from Theresienstadt? And,
yes.
And how did these pieces of art and all this evidence get, saved, essentially? Who had the majority of these pieces? Could you give us a little history about that?
That's a great question. First of all, Terezin was one of the very last places to be liberated. It's liberated, I think it's May 5th, 1945. One of the very, very last places. Towards the end of the war, for those of you who may have family members who came from Slovakia or from Hungary and say, wait a minute, my family was there too. When they started to do the death marches from Auschwitz, many prisoners were marched into Terezin. At that point, it was no longer being, they weren't deporting people. The last deportation to the east was in November 1944. But up until May 1945, people were still arriving in this terrible camp. The conditions were abysmal. It's liberated by the Soviet Army in May 1945. When the Soviet Army liberates them, the Soviet Army barely had any of its own food. It barely had any of its own. It wasn't like the American Army had much better food and things to give to the people who they were liberating. The Soviet Army was kind of living off the land, so many people died after they were liberated. There was this huge virus of typhus that sweeps through the camp, and they send doctors from Prague. So most people had to stay in quarantine in the camp for a month or two until they got the typhus under control, and then many of them went back to Prague. Many of these people, before they were deported, hid things. And like Warsaw Ghetto, which was almost completely destroyed. If anyone's ever been to Warsaw, I mean, you see a few fragments of the wall here and there. There's like one or few buildings that are remaining, just one or two. Everything else was destroyed. This place looks pretty much exactly the way it looked in 1945. All the buildings are there. Everything is intact. It's very, very eerie. And they are still finding things hidden in walls. So people hid artwork in walls. Some artists were able to smuggle these out with the sympathetic Czech policemen. The Czech policemen were a lot more sympathetic than the Polish policemen. They felt like kind of a kinship with their the Czech Jews there, because the Czech Jews and Czech Christians who were of Czech origin and not German origin had much more of a bond. So some of them were able to sneak things out with the Czech policemen. But believe it or not, they're still finding stuff in Terezín, almost 80 years on. And if anyone has ever visited, there's a secret synagogue, this gorgeous synagogue, a little secret one, that was created by Rabbi Berliner. And that was only discovered in the 1990s when the man who owned this building was doing repairs, and they found a secret door to the synagogue. So that's where they find a lot of the stuff. Again, it's something that you won't find in Warsaw, even though we're still looking for the third can of the Ringelblum archives, because the ghetto was almost completely destroyed. Here, the ghetto remained intact, and we're still finding things.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I could be here all night, so if anyone else has another question, ask away.
Thank you.
You just need to unmute yourself. Chuck, do you have a question?
Nope.
All righty, so if no one has any more questions, I'm gonna bid you farewell.
Liz, thank you so much. This was really fascinating.
Wonderful, thank you, everybody,
Thank you
and
very much.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
thank you. And you know
Yeah,
what,
this
Barbara,
was great.
I'll send you, I have a list of reading materials if anyone would like to read up.
Excellent.
Wonderful, and I'll send you some
Okay.
great websites. And if anyone thinks of a question and wants to know the question but doesn't remember it right now, send it to Barbara. And Barbara, you can send it on to me and I'll answer the question.
Terrific.
Okay, and there's things
Terrific.
you can watch online. You can watch, there were actually 2 films that were created in Terezín, not just the one propaganda film. There's actually a film from 1942. You can see these films online. There's an excellent movie called The Prisoner of Paradise about Kurt Goron, the German Jewish artist who was forced to, help produce the second film. A lot of interesting things you can kind of read up online. Peter Ginch wrote a diary. For those of you with grandchildren or children who are trying to find a good first book about the Holocaust for the kids, there's a wonderful book about Friedel Dicker Brandeis, the art teacher who taught art to over 5,000 kids, 500 kids in the ghetto, 600 kids. And the book is called Butterflies in the Dark. It's a wonderful book. It's Butterflies in the Dark. I'll send the name to you. As a Holocaust educator, I highly recommend that book as kind of like a beginning introduction book for children. It's a children's book based on, it's not fiction. It's a real book. So I'll send Barbara in the days to come that list. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right.
You guys
Bye-bye.
have a good evening. Bye from Jerusalem.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.